Hello and welcome to Breaking Embargo. I'm Peter Barnes. That's Mo Metcalf. Let's get into it. Mo, thank you so much for joining us. For those who don't know, Mo is the Director of External Affairs over at the Countryside Alliance, and he's a very good and old friend of mine. How are you doing, Mo?
Great to see you, Peter. Yeah,
it's been a while, hasn't it?
Very old. It's been a long time. Lots of shenanigans along the way.
Yeah, and none of them are repeatable because my mother watches this, so shush. But no, Mo, you're over at the Countryside Alliance. I think the work that you guys are doing right now has never really felt more important because the countryside as a whole, it's obviously we've got the farmers and I'm sure we'll get onto that, but the countryside as a whole just seems to be either neglected, taken advantage of, or is just being ravaged again and again and again. And where do you think this has come from? Because it seems to have gone from 0 to 100 in terms of its kind of attention on the political agenda.
Yeah, I think that's a good analysis. Look, we have a party in power now that has for a long, long time had a hard time connecting with the countryside. And we can go into the reasons why, but there are many. Labour has often had a problem with thinking outside of its more urban-centric nucleus, and as a result, it has left people in the countryside feeling like they don't always get it. And that's probably a generalisation, but it's a fair one. So the Countryside Alliance has spent years, and I mean years, and a lot of it has been banging heads against the wall with Labour, trying to get them to understand that in order to win a general election, you do actually need to win in the countryside. The countryside is not somewhere you can afford just to kind of ignore. To have that majority, you need to be talking to the countryside. Now, what that doesn't necessarily mean is you need to be banging on about rural pursuits and kind of that stuff. What it means is you talk about doing things for the countryside and not to it. And that's largely what a lot of rural people thought. Yeah, rural people, with such a big generalisation, we're talking over 10 million people here. And the Countryside Alliance does its best to represent as many of those as possible, but that's an incredibly diverse range of people. We have different views. But by and large, they have the same concerns and issues that people in urban areas have. And I think we got somewhere in the build-up to the last general election. I don't know if you saw, Peter, but building up to that election, Keir Starmer spent a hell of a lot of time supporting the countryside vote.
He did,
and he did that in a really easy way. I.e., he talked to them, he appeared to listen to their concerns, and managed to manoeuvre his messaging into a rural kind of context. He addressed the NFU conference. He famously wrote for Country Life magazine, which some of your listeners and viewers may read, but that's quite abnormal for Labour to do. He was directly appealing to a rural audience in there, and I felt, and from the Countryside Alliance perspective, we really did feel like they got it, and we were quite comfortable with their kind of positioning on rural issues. Now, there are still issues that they spend overly too much time focusing on hunting, for example. I mean, they've already banned fox hunting, and now they want to ban trail hunting, which is what they told people to do. And now they're saying you can't have that either. So they need to stay away from stuff like that, not go down those kind of toxic culture war issues, but actually just focus on really addressing. But to kick off kind of very early doors on the family farm tax and changes to IHT just seems to me like a complete own goal. They, as I said, they kind of built up a lot of kudos in the years building under Starmer's leadership. I will say, certainly not under Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah,
I mean, he was completely he is what he is, right? But Keir Starmer did clearly care. But to kind of build up all that goodwill and then just basically chuck it out with this really bad policy change. I mean, it's Peter. I cannot describe the damage that policy change is going to have in the countryside. You know, I speak to people regularly who are going to be impacted by it. They are not posho. You know, as Michael Gove said, they're not all Duke of Buccleuch with big 4x4s and plastic. They're not like that. These are working people in the countryside. I consider them public servants for the work that they do, and they have just had the worst possible news about their futures and delivered. And the government's response, knowing full well that it's probably got this one wrong. I'm not convinced they believe this. I think they know they've got it wrong. But their inability to kind of talk to, or at least find the way forward with the countryside, has been a massive mistake. And that's why it's important, I guess, that you have organisations like the Countryside Alliance there to try and make the case for farmers and rural people. But also groups like the National Farmers Union, the CLA too, we're all doing our part. But my worry for, and I speak neutrally here politically, my worry for Labour in the countryside now is it's gone so early that I think it's going to be very difficult for them to kind of rebuild that trust. And as I say, a lot of time and effort went into rebuilding that relationship. And for it to just kind of be dismantled so early is a really, just strategically, Peter, a politically very stupid thing to have done.
Yeah. Yeah. For me, Mo, you hit the key word there, and that's trust. There seems to be a complete breakdown of trust between the countryside and those communities and the government. Just a complete, so they're not even in the same building, let alone the same room at the moment in terms of working through this together. Like, you know, you've got each side accusing everybody of all sorts of things when it comes to this farmer's tax. And it really does strike me as a very bizarre move. Like you said, they built up so much kudos, so much trust with, you know, a party, like you say, that isn't traditionally linked with the kind of countryside kind of archetype, as it were. And yet it is interesting. I've never really thought about it this way, Mo, that they've just thrown all that out of the window, like just completely for what seems to be not a lot of gain in the long term or the short term, realistically, because do you think because a lot of initially when I saw this, I thought it was more they just don't like farmers and they see farmers as rich people. Do you think that mentality has just creeped back in for the Labour Party?
My concern is at the top level, they were politically naive.
Yeah.
I think they felt this would be a bit of a storm in the teacup, but we kind of move on from it. And they've completely misjudged it because, as I say, the conversations are not really going to move forward in the countryside until that issue is addressed. It is the biggest issue in the countryside now. They've made it that way. But remember, they actually told them they weren't going to do it. So they told farmers, they're very clear that they weren't going to do it. So trust being the big word here. And they have a large number of rural seats, but also kind of what I call rural adjacent seats. So it's those seats that do have countryside in them, but they're not necessarily exclusively countryside.
Yeah.
So that figure goes from about 85 to 150, depending on how broad you want to look at the countryside as an electoral force. That's a very big number.
Oh.
And if you were McSweeney, and I just don't get why he would have come to this conclusion, but you know, there are some in Westminster. You know, part of my job is to go around listening and talking to people and just trying to get you know, bits of information. You know the job, Peter, and find to piece things together so I can understand from a strategic point of view how to move things forward. And the kind of assumption is, they've kind of given up on the concept of winning those seats again, which is mad.
Yeah.
You know, the Conservative Party reform, the Liberal Democrats, it's not a given, that any of those parties are necessarily going to stroll ahead in the countryside.
Mm.
And the idea that they kind of made ground in places where there's barely ever been a Labour candidate, let alone a Labour MP, and that they would choose to throw that away. I find it, I just said, politically bizarre. Like, forget one's own emotions in this discussion. Think just about politics and strategy. I just think it was terrible. And I've noticed, from a purely comms perspective, that Labour or the government's kind of comms game has got a lot better. I think there's been some changes at number 10 in terms of personnel that have led to the comms grid being a bit more in order. I'd like to think that whoever they had in before, the current new people, are responsible for just completely misunderstanding the gravitas of the situation. But that wouldn't have happened. I almost think it wouldn't have happened now. I just feel that the government are a little bit more on it now.
Yeah, I often think the problem I think this Labour government have is there's been nobody of experience of government at the top level. Realistically, if you look at the cabinet, you've got Ed Miliband, Yvette Cooper, and I think there's only really those two, maybe one more, who have actually been in government before. Labour seem to have this idea that just because you've been around Westminster and you've been an MP for a long time, you know how government works. You don't. Till you're in the building, you really don't. And I think the learning curve has been very sharp for this government. And I think they're starting to realize, I do think they're kicking back in. I think they're still making mistake after mistake. But that kind of tightening up of things, I think you're right. I think we are seeing a little bit. But on the comms game, it's interesting you say it's got better, because I look at where they were in opposition. That was a solid comms game. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were online. Nobody had no kind of anybody straying out of it. They got into government, and it's like the circus came to town. It was insane.
It did. I think that's a fair point. So I think taking that apart, you've got going into the election, absolutely. Message discipline was on point. That wasn't that difficult to do.
Yeah.
Because I think from a Labour, the wider Labour family's perspective, victory was clearly in sight. And they all kind of signed up to the notion that we just need to get through this. We're going to win. Let's behave ourselves. And they did. Post, in the initial few months, and I include with that the comms and strategy around the budget and specifically the family farm tax, completely dropped the ball. And the ramifications of that are still happening. I mean, barely a week goes by where I'm not contacted, or the NFU or CLA aren't contacted about something to do with this story. It's one of those stories that just will not go away, because actually, as the changes come in, the impact will lead to closures. It will lead to, and I'm sorry to say it, but severe breakdown of mental health, worsening. And those stories are just not going to go away. And for the sake of raising money, the equivalent of a day and a smidge of NHS funding, to destroy your network of family farms, to undermine your food security, to essentially have to, create a scenario where you're going to have to depend on foreign imports for food. Why? I don't get it. But from a back to comms, I just feel that they have gone a bit sharper in recent months. That's not to say that that's not a view on policy itself.
That's the thing. I always have to kind of explain to people that when I say they've got better on comms, it's not that I am agreeing with them. It's this in terms of how it's presented and how it's being rolled out has got better. And I think that's the problem with politico types, is we look at things a little differently compared to the kind of average person on the street. I always kind of feel the need to mention that to people.
And as you know, Peter, you can't have one without the other. Comms is policy. It's like when people used to say, I always used to think of the Liz Truss example, when people said, the the policy was right, but the comms are wrong. Well, no, the comms is the policy. So if you fail with the comms, the policy is redundant and irrelevant, and you've lost. So look, it's a fascinating time at the moment. But a lot of what I'm trying to do is to keep the government on a road of actually delivering for the countryside and not slipping back into that kind of doing things for ideological kicks environment, and that actually the countryside is a friend. It's a friend of all parties, actually. I mean, you can't paint it in any one light, particularly not now. And to try and get them to urge to resist that temptation. And it's not that easy. I like to think that there are people in government that really do get it. But I just feel that, I look at their manifesto priorities for the countryside, and there was very little actually mentioned about.
I think, was it Labour that only mentioned farming was it 19 words or something ridiculous?
Something like 19. Yeah, it was. I mean, you would have literally sneezed and you would have missed it all entirely. The only priority that I could find was them talking about trail hunting, which I just find bizarre. I just don't understand. I get that there are probably some people in the Labour backbenches that think it's a really great thing to do, but actually no one cares. People in the countryside don't care. I think if you were to put it at a push, people would go, "Why just kind of leave them alone?" Really is that what we're going to focus on when you've got horrendous levels of social deprivation.
See, this is what I wanted to get onto, Mo, was, obviously the farmers' tax is a main priority, but there are so many underlying features, and, rural poverty, I think has been kind of in the background of kind of my awareness for the countryside for quite some time. And yet, I mean, when we look at it from a public perspective, it's barely unknown. Everybody presumes that people in the countryside are particularly wealthy. I think it could be further from the truth.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, look, you only have to go to places like in Cornwall, for example, where, most people automatically think Cornwall, they think beaches, seaside, beauty, wealth, second homes. But there are two very different stories in Cornwall. You do have that, but then you do have a lot of deprivation. If you lose a job in Cornwall, it's extremely hard to find another one, owing to the fact that public transport isn't as good, that there just simply isn't the same level of investment and opportunities, and getting out, I mean, you'd have to literally pick up your life and move it entirely. Social mobility it's not the same. And from rural poverty and beyond, I mean, we look at a lot of what we do is around rural crime, for example, and understanding the kind of issues that they have to face that are very unique from towns and from towns. They still have the same levels of crimes and the same types of crimes, but in the countryside they have a completely different range that are unique to the countryside. That just, despite battling the police, they just don't seem to really have the resources to deal with. Anything from fly tipping, and I'm not talking about someone chucking a magazine out the window. I'm talking about industrial level stuff that's done on a farmer's field, and he or she has to pay for that to be removed, or they face penalties. And that they can be accused of it. And so it's all the way from that to tractor machinery theft. We have.
I read somewhere. Didn't you guys do a report about churches?
Yeah. We did. That's something I've been doing on and off for years now. Actually, it's kind of in its 6th year, and essentially what it does is it puts a spotlight on crimes committed against or at churches.
Yeah.
So that ranges from people stealing, I don't know, candlestick holders and lead from the roof, which is really common, to actually arson and criminal, clear attacks on the church in that way. And the reason we do focus on that, although it's a national issue, like so many things to do with the countryside and crime, there is a lack of awareness about it, I think. And if you think about a church in the countryside, they're isolated. They might not necessarily be open Monday to Sunday, or Monday to Saturday, I should say, and therefore are sitting there basically dormant all week, and therefore are easy prey. Um, and to me, and I'm not very religious. It's not a case of it's not a thing about Christianity. For me, it's about heritage.
Mm.
The reason that these buildings matter is because in the countryside, and you could certainly argue this from an urban perspective, but in the countryside, the church is a lot more than a place where you go and pray on Sunday. It's kind of like a pub.
Yeah.
It glues the community together. And the idea that we're allowing these places to be vandalized, neglected, rampaged through by criminals is horrifying.
Yeah.
And we've had a huge response to that, actually.
Yeah, so if you think about it, in the countryside, the community might be miles apart. So the churches became a kind of a hub to kind of keep people together. Because, in some bits of the country, you could actually go quite some time without seeing another human being if you really, if there's some really isolated points. So for those kind of community buildings, it doesn't necessarily have to be a church or anything like that. Like you say, to be vandalized in that way is an attack on the community itself. And they're supposed to take that rather personally.
It does, yeah, they do. And everyone's always horrified when they hear about these anecdotal stories of some loons have gone into a church and spray painted devil horns, that kind of stuff. But actually, when we pulled it all together using the police, it's thanks to the police that we could do it because it's through the Freedom of Information Act. What we saw was thousands and thousands of crimes reported daily all over the country. And I think it's a serious problem in the sense that I think it's a thing. I don't just think it's, as I say, anecdotal. I think this is a well-organized, particularly when it comes to the vets. It's like with most vets in the countryside on tractors and heavy plant machinery, it's organized. We're talking about a group of, very well-oiled criminals who know exactly what they're doing and are targeting these places. It's not just some cheeky chappie who's going in and pinching £2 out the donations tin or whatever. It's serious. It's organised crime. I suspect a lot of it, particularly in relation to farm machinery theft, but it's international. So it's a lot of it's taken away and overnight stuck on a ferry. Before you know it's in Europe. By the time the farmer or the church have even noticed that what's happened,
gone. Yeah,
it's long gone. The police can't do anything about it.
No, it's terrible.
I was talking to a farmer the other day. Sorry,
I was going to say, in a way, to try and find like the silver lining out of this, the farmers' tax situation is really put the countryside in the public's mind, like more so now than ever. I mean, I've talked about the countryside more in the last 6 months than I have in the last 5 years, easily. And I think that there's an opportunity here for real change.
I agree with you. I think that's exactly what's happened. And it's very easy, as you know, Peter, when you're in an industry or you're in a space to overly analyze the relevance of your space in the wider national context. That's why I always try and pull myself out at all times and speak to as many kind of industry level people like me as possible to understand the kind of priorities of both from a PR perspective and also a political one. But this is why Labour have got it so wrong, is that they're not dealing with some like niche issue. They're not attacking some kind of divisive community or a Marmite community. Or, do you know what I mean? They are attacking a group of people that the public fundamentally like and sympathise with. And that's another thing that shows how bad and wrong they've got it. And so when people talk about but the Labour Party will lose with the farming vote. I mean, well, yeah, the farming vote, and I've said this many times, the farming vote is actually quite dispersed and it's not a huge number. It's the farming adjacent vote, which is very big in the countryside, but it's urban too. Urban people love their farmers. We just Future Countryside, which is an organisation that kind of brings various rural voices together from the environmental but also the farming side. They had some polling out this week. I'm not sure if you saw it, but it showed that actually Gen Z, so those born between 1997 and 2012, view farmers as the best champions of the countryside, not environmental activists. It view farmers.
That's
And obviously, I think a big part of that, I think we can thank Jeremy Clarkson. I think Jeremy Clarkson has been instrumental in putting forward the struggles that farmers face in a really raw and honest way. If you look at the current offering of BBC countryside programming, it's kind of chocolate box.
Yeah, it's a little twee, isn't it? I always say Jeremy Clarkson has done more for farming than Country File has in the last 10 years.
I think a lot of people would agree. And I think that, Country File, it serves its purpose. It does shine a lot on farming issues. But I wouldn't say it necessarily always demonstrates the raw side of how difficult it is. And Jeremy has managed to do that in his own unique way. And I think a lot of programming is kind of sometimes overly focused on the nature aspect. And actually, it's so important that people understand how food gets from the farm to your plate. It's not just the supermarket. It's not Amazon. It's farmers. And I think that has massively helped the farmers in their hour of need. And if you look at the polls consistently, the public are anti these changes. And that's why I just think Labour have got it so wrong. And I'm not sure in this kind of post-Christmas reshuffle and rejig at Downing Street, I don't think it would have happened like this.
I think the great thing is out of this is it's rather humanized farming. It's shown that it's not just, this kind of big kind of machinery. It is people. And it's people and it's families and the things that they sacrifice. I think you were right when you said it's a form of public service being a farmer. I genuinely do. They work incredibly long hours for very little, like near enough nothing in terms of money. And also now it seems to be that they have a government that doesn't care that much about that sacrifice that they make. But honestly, Mo, do keep up the fight. You've always got my support. And thank you so much for joining us. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you, Mo.